The grand chamber of the Galactic Defense Council stretched across 300 meters of polished obsidian floor, ceiling lost in artificial starlight that mimicked the cosmos beyond the station walls. And today, that chamber echoed with laughter at humanity's expense. Commander Sarah Chen stood at the presentation podium with her back straight and her face carefully neutral, while the holographic display behind her rotated a three-dimensional image of the HTSV Nightingale, and the assembled representatives from 47 different species were not taking her. Seriously, Admiral Vexter of the Kryn hegemony rose from his seat, with his forearms crossed over his broad chest and his translator converting his clicking speech into standard galactic. "Let me understand this correctly," he said, and his tone dripped with amusement. "Humanity claims to have built a warship powered by what you call resonance, harmonics, and armed with narrative. Causality projectors." The chamber erupted in fresh laughter, and Sarah waited for it to die down before responding. "That is correct, Admiral," she said calmly. "The Nightingale operates on principles that our scientists discovered 20 years ago during quantum consciousness experiments." Delegate from the Fexler Confederation chittered in disbelief. "Your technical specifications mention belief field generators, and I have reviewed theoretical physics for 3 centuries, and no such technology exists in any known framework." Sarah touched her control pad, and the hologram zoomed in on the ship's core structure, and the Nightingale did not look like any warship the galaxy had ever seen, because its hull curved in impossible ways, and crystalline structures grew along its spine. Like the pipes of some cosmic organ, and observation ports glowed with soft colors that seemed to shift based on who was looking at them. "The Nightingale was not built using conventional physics," Sarah explained. "Our scientists discovered that consciousness and belief have measurable effects on quantum substrates when filtered through specific resonance frequencies, and we learned to harness this." Vexter's laughter boomed across the chamber. "And your crew manifest is even more ridiculous," he said while pulling up the document on his own display. 127 personnel, including 3 storytellers and 2 musicians and a philosopher, and what kind of military vessel needs a philosopher? More laughter rippled through assembly, and Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "The Nightingale systems require specific neural patterns to operate effectively," she said. "Our crew selection reflects operational necessities." The Fexler delegate shook her crystalline head. "Commander Chen and humanity has contributed much to galactic society, but this borders on fantasy, and I move that we table this discussion and return to practical defense matters." The motion passed with overwhelming support, and Sarah gathered her materials while trying to ignore the pitying looks and barely suppressed chuckles from the departing delegates, and only the Delvar representative offered her a sympathetic nod. Before leaving, Sarah stood alone in the empty chamber for a long moment and stared at the rotating image of the Nightingale. And let them laugh, she thought, because they would understand soon enough. Meanwhile, at Kepler Station, in the remote reaches of human-controlled space, Captain James Okonkwo walked the corridors of the ship that everyone else thought was a fairy tale. Nightingale hummed around him, and not the mechanical hum of conventional engines, but something alive and musical in the crystalline structures that lined the walls pulsed with gentle light that responded to his presence, and after 15 years of working with this vessel, he still found it beautiful. "Captain," called a voice from behind, and he turned to see Chief Engineer Dr. Yuki Tanaka approaching with a new crew member in tow, and the young ensign looked nervous. "Dr. Tanaka," James acknowledged. "Is this our new navigation specialist, Ensign Marcus Webb?" "Reporting for duty, sir," the young man said, and snapped a sharp salute. But his eyes kept darting to the singing walls. James returned the salute with a slight smile. "At ease, Ensign, and I see you are already noticing our ship's unique qualities." "Sir, I have to ask," Marcus said hesitantly, "is it true what they say, and that this ship runs on belief and stories?" Yuki laughed and adjusted her glasses. "It's not quite that simple, Ensign, but not entirely wrong either. And come with us, and I will show you the resonance core." They walked deeper into the ship and past crew members, who moved with practiced ease through corridors that seemed to shift slightly when you were not looking directly at them, and Marcus nearly jumped when a wall chimed a greeting as he passed the resonance core chamber open before them, and Marcus stopped dead in his tracks because the core was not like anything in conventional engineering and crystalline towers. rose 30 meters through the center of the chamber, and energy flowed between them in patterns that looked almost like sheet music, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with potential. "What you are seeing," Yuki explained, "is the physical manifestation of focused quantum probability. Fields and our scientists discovered that human consciousness, when properly trained and amplified, can interact with the quantum foam of reality itself." Marcus stared in wonder. "But how is that possible?" James stepped forward. 20 years ago, during deep space experiments, our researchers found that thoughts and beliefs and stories all have measurable quantum signatures, and they learned that with the right resonance frequencies, these signatures could be amplified and focused. "The universe," Yuki continued, "is not as fixed as we thought, and at the quantum level, reality is probabilistic, and what the Nightingale does is shift those probabilities by believing things into existence," Marcus said slowly. "By aligning quantum possibilities with narrative structures that consciousness recognizes," James corrected. "A ship cannot dodge a missile by believing it will miss, but if you create the right resonance field and establish the right narrative framework, then the probability of the missile missing increases." Dramatically, Marcus walked slowly around the core and watched the energy patterns shift and flow, and the rest of the galaxy thinks this is nonsense. They think it violates known physics, Yuki said with a shrug. "And they are right, because it does, and that is the entire point." James checked his chronometer. "Ensign Webb, you will have plenty of time to learn our systems, but right now we have our weekly storytelling session in 30 minutes, and attendance is mandatory." Marcus blinked. "Storytelling session, sir. The storytellers maintain the ships." "Narrative field," James explained. "They weave the stories that give the quantum processors their framework, and without them the Nightingale is just an oddly shaped hole with pretty lights." They left the core chamber and headed toward the assembly hall, and Marcus still looked uncertain but curious, and James remembered his own first days aboard this impossible ship and how long it took him to truly believe in the assembly hall. The crew gathered in comfortable seats while the three storytellers prepared at the front, and these were not military personnel in the traditional sense, but they were essential to every operation, and senior storyteller Patricia Okoye stood, and the room quieted. "Today's tale," she began, and her voice carrying easily through the space, "is about the ship that sailed between stars on songs of possibility, and about the crew who learned that reality is more flexible than physics textbooks claim." As she spoke, the walls began to resonate, and the crystalline structures picked up harmonics from her voice and transformed them into something more, and Marcus felt it in his bones, because this was not entertainment, but something fundamental to how the ship operated. The story wove through tales of human persistence and unlikely victories, and the power of belief backed by understanding, and as Patricia spoke, the very air seemed to solidify around her words and give them weight and substance. James watched his crew and saw them leaning forward in their minds, unconsciously linking with the ship's systems and strengthening the resonance fields that kept the Nightingale functioning. And this was humanity's secret, because they had learned to weaponize the oldest human technology of all. Stories had always shaped human reality, and now they shaped physical reality too. After the session ended, Marcus approached James with wide eyes. "Sir, I felt something during that story, and like the ship was listening." "The ship was listening," James confirmed, "and so was every quantum processor in the resonance core, and you will learn to feel it more clearly as you integrate with the navigation systems." "Do you really think this can work in combat?" Marcus asked. Quietly, James looked out the viewport at the stars beyond. "The galaxy is about to face threats they cannot imagine. Ensign and conventional weapons will not be enough, and the Nightingale represents something new, because we fight not just with weapons, but with the power of what humans have always done best." "What is that, sir?" "We tell stories that change the world," James said. "And now those stories can change reality itself." The Nightingale hummed in agreement, and somewhere far away in the Galactic Defense Council chamber, Sarah Chen received a priority message, and the Kryn hegemony was moving forces toward the Delvar system, and war was coming soon. The galaxy would learn that humanity's fairy tale was about to become their salvation. The alert klaxons wailed through the Galactic Defense Council station at 0400 Standard Time, and delegates stumbled from their quarters in various states of readiness. and the emergency session convened within. 20 minutes. Admiral Vexter stood at the central display where a tactical map showed the Delvar system surrounded by red threat markers, and his expression was grim. 47 Kryn warships entered the Delvar system 3 hours ago. He reported they have established a complete blockade and are demanding surrender and total submission to Hegemony Authority. The Delvar representative was a thin, gray-skinned humanoid named Kelvis, and his hands shook as he gripped the podium. 4.3 billion civilians live on Delvar Prime, and our orbital defense platforms cannot withstand a sustained assault. And we have perhaps 48 hours before they fall, Sarah. Chen stood in the human observation section and felt her stomach clench, because Delvar was a peaceful world, and home to 17 different species who had chosen neutrality and the Kryn. Attack was a clear violation of every galactic treaty. What forces can we deploy? Demanded the Fexler delegate Vexter. What? Manipulated the display, and yellow markers appeared showing galactic defense positions. Our nearest battle group is the 7th Fleet under my command, and we can reach Delvar in 6 days. If we push our engines to maximum 6 days, Kelvis repeated hollowly, the Kryn will begin bombardment. Into the chamber erupted an urgent discussion, and delegates argued about diplomatic solutions and economic sanctions and appeals to Kryn honor, but Sarah knew none of it mattered because the hegemony had calculated the risks and decided the reward was worth it. She stood, and her voice cut through the chaos. The Nightingale can reach Delvar in 32 hours. The chamber fell silent, and then the silence broke into laughter. And even now, with billions of lives at stake, they could not take humanity's ship. Cirrus Levexathor's expression mixed pity and frustration. Commander Chen, I appreciate your desire to help, but sending your experimental vessel against a Kryn armada is suicide, and I will not have human deaths on my conscience. Because of desperation. With respect, Admiral Sarah said firmly. The Nightingale is the only vessel that can arrive in time, and my captain and crew are prepared to deploy. Immediately, the Fexler delegate shook her crystalline head. Even if your ship functions as claimed, in which I doubt a single vessel cannot stand against 47 warships, including 3 dreadnoughts, and this is not reasonable. Sarah pulled up the Nightingale specifications on the main display. Our vessel operates outside conventional tactical parameters, and we request permission to attempt intervention. This is madness, muttered a delegate from the Bakelvis. Stepped forward, and his voice desperate. If there is any chance and any possibility that the human ship can buy us time, then I beg the Council to authorize it. Vexter studied Sarah for a long moment, and his 4 eyes searching her face. You truly believe your ship can make a difference? I believe our crew will give everything they have to save those people, Sarah answered, and I believe the Nightingale is capable of things this Council has not yet accepted as possible. The vote was close, but desperation won out, and the Council authorized the Nightingale to deploy to Delvar. And as the session ended, Vexter approached Sarah privately. I am ordering the 7th Fleet to emergency deployment anyway, he said quietly. We will arrive in 6 days, and I pray we find your crew alive, but I do not expect to. Sarah met his gaze steadily. You may be surprised, Admiral. Across the galaxy at Kepler Station, the priority alert reached Captain James Conquo while he was reviewing navigation charts with Marcus Webb, and the message was brief but clear because Delvar needed them. And they had 30 hours to cross space that should take 3 days. James activated the shipwide come. All hands to battle stations, and this is not a drill, and storytellers to the narrative. Chamber and engineers to resonance, core and all crew. Prepare for quantum drive engagement. The Nightingale came alive around him, and the crystalline structures blazed with light, and the humming intensified to something between a song and a war cry and crew. Members rushed to their stations with practiced efficiency because they had trained for this in the narrative chamber. The 3 storytellers took their positions in specially designed chairs that connected directly to the ship's quantum processors, and Patricia Okoye closed her eyes and felt the ship's consciousness brush against her own. Beginning narrative framework, she said, and her voice echoed through the resonance field. The tale of the ship that crossed impossible distances because there were people who needed saving. The other 2 storytellers joined her, and their minds linking in the pattern. They had practiced for years, and together they wove the story of urgency and necessity and the compression of space-time through sheer narrative will and engineering. Yuki Tanaka monitored readings that made no sense by conventional physics. Resonance cores at 200% and holding steady in quantum, probability fields establishing and narrative drive charging. James sat in the captain's chair, surrounded by displays, showing ship status and tactical data and crew readiness, and the weight of what they were about to attempt pressed on his shoulders because this was not a test. "Any more crew status?" he called. "All stations, report ready," replied his first officer. Lieutenant Commander Andrei Volkov. "Storyteller's report, narrative framework established and stable." came. Patricia's voice engineering confirms resonance cores optimal. Yuki Adijans took a deep breath. "Engage quantum narrative drive." Reality twisted. Around the Nightingale and the ship did not accelerate in any conventional sense, but rather convinced the universe that it needed to be somewhere else, and the probability of being at Kepler station decreased while the probability of being near Delvar increased, and space-time reorganized itself around the narrative inside. The ship, the crew felt the transition like falling through a story, and past, present, and future blurred together, and Marcus gripped his console as the navigation, the display, showed impossible readings because they were moving through space by riding the probability waves of their own story. "This is incredible," he whispered. "This is terrifying," corrected the officer beside him. "And you never quite get used to it. The journey that should have taken 3 days compressed into 31 hours of sustained narrative drive, and the storytellers worked in shifts, maintaining the framework, while engineers constantly adjusted the resonance cores, and the entire crew felt the strain as their consciousness became part of the ship's impossible movement." James walked the corridors during the transit and checked on his people and saw the exhaustion in their eyes, but also the determination, because every person on this ship had volunteered, knowing what it might cost, and they believed in what they were doing. In the narrative chamber he found Patricia during her rest shift, and she looked pale and drawn. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "The narrative is strong," she replied, "but maintaining this speed requires constant reinforcement. And we are telling the universe a story it does not want to believe. Can you hold it for another 6 hours?" She smiled weakly. "We will hold it as long as Delvar needs us to." Hold it. On the bridge, as they neared their destination, Volkov ran tactical assessments of what they would face in 47 Kryn warships was not just a challenge but a near impossibility, and conventional tactics said they should run. "Captain," Volkov said carefully, "I have reviewed every battle scenario, and the odds are not favorable." James nodded. "Conventional odds do not apply to us, and we do not fight by conventional rules."
Ow.
"But can the narrative field protect us against that much?" "Firepower, we are about to find out." The Nightingale dropped out of quantum narrative drive at the edge of the Delvar system, and the transition was violent enough to rattle teeth and send loose objects flying. And then they were there in sensor data flooded the displays. 47 Kryn warships in formation around Delvar Prime, and orbital platforms sparking with damage from warning shots, and civilian evacuation ships trapped in docks and unable to launch, and time was up. James stood and straightened his uniform. "Open a channel to Delvar Defense Command and let them know help has arrived." On Delvar Prime in the Underground Command Center, General Bothrak received the transmission and stared at his display in disbelief because a single human ship had appeared, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. "One ship," his tactical officer said. "The humans sent one ship. That is the Nightingale," Bothrak said quietly, because he had heard the rumors and the impossible stories. "And if even half of what humanity claims is true, then perhaps one ship is enough aboard the lead Kryn dreadnought." Commander Zhalkos reviewed the sensor data on the new arrival, and his tactical AI was confused because the ship's energy signature made no sense, and its position kept shifting slightly, even though it was not moving, and something was wrong. "What is that vessel?" he demanded. "Analysis indicates it is the human experimental ship designated Nightingale," his science officer reported. "Records show it as non-threatening and possibly non-functional." Kale studied the strange ship on his display, and its crystalline structures, and impossible curves maintain blockade formation, and monitor the human vessel, and if it approaches in a threatening manner, destroy it. The Nightingale glided through the outer reaches of Delvar's system, and its hull blazing with colors that sensors struggled to classify, and on every Kryn warship alarms began to sound as their targeting systems failed to establish solid locks. On the human vessel commander Jalkos gripped his command console as his tactical display flickered and glitched. What is happening to our sensors? A human ship is emitting energy on frequencies we cannot properly measure, his science officer reported, and her voice tight with confusion. It appears in multiple locations simultaneously, or perhaps it is moving in ways our instruments cannot track. That is impossible, Jalkos snapped. No ship can exist in multiple places at once. I am reporting what the sensors show, sir. On the Nightingale's bridge, James watched the Kryn fleet adjust their formation and trying to account for a threat. They did not understand, and he felt the ship humming beneath him and alive with purpose and ready. Begin broadcast, he ordered throughout the Delver system on every frequency and through every channel the Nightingale began to transmit. Then it was not a message of warning or demand for surrender, but rather a symphony in the ships. Musicians had composed something that resonated with the quantum frequencies of the resonance chorus. The music was beautiful and strange and impossible to ignore, and it carried harmonics that made reality itself vibrate. And on Delvar Prime, civilians stopped in the streets and looked up at the sky with tears streaming down their faces, because somehow they could feel hope in that song. Aboard the Kryn ship's crew members clutched their heads as the music penetrated their hulls and bypassed their audio systems to resonate directly in their consciousness, and it was not painful but deeply unsettling because the song carried meanings their minds could not quite grasp. Jam that transmission, Jalkos ordered. We are trying, sir, but it is not using conventional broadcasting methods, and it is as if the music is emerging from space-time itself. The Nightingale completed its approach and took up a position between the Kryn fleet and Delvar Prime in one small ship facing 47 warships, and the absurdity of it would have been laughable if not for the way reality was bending around the human vessel. Jalkos had fought in 34 battles during his career, and he recognized courage when he saw it, but this was something else, because courage without capability was just suicide. Open fire, he commanded. Destroy that ship. 14 Kryn destroyers unleashed their weapons simultaneously, and plasma bolts and kinetic rounds and energy beams converged on the Nightingale's position from multiple angles, and the volume of fire was enough to vaporize a small moon, and it should have ended the battle before it began. The weapons passed through space, where the Nightingale was and should have been and must have been, according to all physical laws, and yet somehow the ship remained untouched, and rounds that should have hit solid hull instead found only empty vacuum, and explosions blossomed in spaces. The Nightingale had already left, or perhaps had never been impossible. Breathe, Jalkos direct hit confirmation on 7 separate shots, and the human ship is still there. His science officer stared at her instruments. Sir, the readings suggest the ship is altering local probability fields, and our weapons are not missing because they are hitting spaces where the probability of the ship's existing has been reduced to near zero. You are saying they are making it less likely for our shots to hit. I am saying they are editing reality itself, sir. On the Nightingale, Yuki monitored the belief field generators as they worked overtime in converting the crew's consciousness and the storyteller's narratives into quantum shields. And conventional shields absorbed energy, but these shields made attacks less likely to occur in the first place, probability displacement holding at 97%. She reported, but we cannot maintain this indefinitely, and each manipulation costs us. James nodded grimly. Weapons free and target their formation anchors. The Nightingale's narrative causality projectors came online, and these were not energy weapons or kinetic cannons, but something far stranger, and they fired concentrated beams of narrative inevitability and of story logic made manifest. The first beam struck a Kryn destroyer, and the ship's systems immediately began to fail in a cascade of improbable malfunctions, and a cooling pump that had worked flawlessly for 15 years suddenly seized, and the backup system that should have engaged failed to activate because a connection had worked loose at precisely the wrong moment, and within seconds. The reactor entered emergency shutdown, and the ship went dark, Report Jalkos demanded. The destroyer Relentless has suffered catastrophic system failure, sir, and engineering reports indicate impossible coincidence of malfunctions and all occurring simultaneously. Another Kryn ship shuddered as a narrative beam washed over it, and suddenly the crew found themselves experiencing what could only be described as the worst day possible, and weapons failed to charge and navigation plotted wrong courses, and even the environmental systems began having problems, and the ship had become unlucky in ways that defied statistical analysis. Patricia's voice echoed through the nightingale as she wove her combat narrative. The tale continues of the fleet that sailed with such confidence, but found themselves undone by the very laws they thought they knew, and of systems that failed not through damage but through the inexorable logic of dramatic necessity. A Kryn dreadnought fired its main cannon, and a weapon capable of cracking planets and the massive energy beam crossed the distance to the nightingale in microseconds and should have reduced the human ship to scattered atoms, and instead the beam refracted at an angle that physics said was impossible and splashed harmlessly against empty space. Their weapons cannot touch them, Jalkos said in growing horror, and our ships are falling apart for no reason, and what manner of warfare is this on Delvar? Prime the civilian defense shelters watched the battle on emergency broadcasts, and General Vothrak stood transfixed as his displays showed impossible combat in a single human ship dancing through fire that should have destroyed it 100 times over. How are they doing this? His tactical officer whispered. I do not know, Vothrak admitted. But I am grateful they are on our side. Marcus Webb, at the navigation console, felt the ship moving through space in ways his training said were impossible, and he was not steering the nightingale so much as suggesting where it might want to be, and the ship itself made the final decisions based on narrative flow. In probability optimization, sir, the ship is moving on its own, he reported. The ship is following the story, James corrected. You are guiding the narrative, and the nightingale is manifesting it into reality, and trust your instincts. 5 more Kryn ships fell to cascading failures in their crews, abandoning vessels that had become death traps of malfunctioning systems and exploding consoles and impossible accidents, and the remaining ships began to waver in their formations, watched his fleet disintegrating, and not from superior firepower but from reality itself, turning against them. All ships concentrate fire on a single point in spacetime, he ordered. If they manipulate probability, then we will create certainty. Through overwhelming force, 32 warships swiveled their weapons to target the exact same coordinates and firing solutions, synchronized down to the nanosecond, and every gun and every missile and every energy weapon launched simultaneously. At a single point where the nightingale would have 2 Beatty volume of fire was so concentrated that it created what Jalkos hoped for, because a probability anchor and a point of such certain destruction that it and spacetime itself groaned under the assaulton. The nightingale alarms shrieked as the belief field generators overloaded. Probability anchor detected, Yuki shouted. We cannot disperse this much concentrated certainty. The weapon struck, and the nightingale shuddered violently, and hull plates buckled and crystalline structures shattered, and the first real damage the ship had taken, and crew members were thrown from their stations, and Patricia screamed as feedback from the narrative chamber burned through her neural links. James hauled himself back into his chair as sparks rained from overhead conduits. Damage report. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 6. Volkov called out. Resonance core 3 is offline in belief field. Generators at 40% capacity, and we have casualties. The nightingale limped through space, trailing atmosphere and debris, and suddenly looking very mortal, and the Kryn fleet sensed victory and began to close in. But James looked around at his bridge crew and saw bloodied faces and determined eyes, and felt the ship still humming beneath him, and wounded but alive and angry, and he made his decision. All power to the Mythweaver array, he ordered. Eucus head snapped up. Sir, that system is untested, and we do not know what it will do at full power. We know what happens if we do nothing, James replied. Activated. Deep in the heart of the nightingale, ancient systems came online for the first time in combat, and the Mythweaver array was humanity's greatest achievement and most dangerous creation, because it did not just manipulate probability or impose narrative logic, but rather it transformed the ship itself into a living story. Across the galaxy in the Galactic Defense Council station, every delegate and military officer and civilian observer crowded around displays showing the battle at Delvar, and the feed was being broadcast in real time through quantum relays, and what they witnessed defied everything they thought they knew about warfare. Admiral Vexler stood with his four hands, gripping the edge of his command console hard, enough to leave marks in the metal, and his eyes could not look away from the impossible sight of a single human vessel systematically dismantling a Kryn armada. The tactical computer has given up trying to predict the human ship's movements, his aide reported quietly. It says the Nightingale is not following any known physical laws. Can see that, Vexler said, and his voice hollow with shock. I have fought for 200 years, and I have never seen anything like this. The Vexler delegate, who had mocked the Nightingale during Sarah Chen's presentation, now stood silent, with her crystalline features reflecting the light from the displays and her earlier seer certainty shattered like glass. This cannot be real, she whispered. No single ship can do this. But the evidence played out before them as the Nightingale blazed with impossible light and moved through Kryn weapons fire like it was dancing through rain, and each movement seemed choreographed to some cosmic script that only the human crew could read. Sarah Chen watched with tears streaming down her face because she had believed in her people and in the Nightingale, but seeing it actually work was different from believing it could work, and the weight of vindication, mixed with terror for the crew she knew was suffering to make this possible on the Nightingale. That suffering was reaching critical levels, and in the narrative chamber, Patricia Okoye felt blood running from her nose and ears as her mind interfaced directly with systems that were pushing far beyond tested limits, and the other two storytellers were in similar condition, but they could not stop. The story demands completion. Patricia gasped out, the hero must face the final trial and overcome impossible odds, and we are past the point of retreat. Her fellow storyteller Marcus Thompson nodded. Weekly, the narrative structure requires climax and resolution, and we have to see this through. In engineering, Yuki Tanaka watched readings that made her want to scream because the resonance cores were operating at 340% of tested capacity, and crystalline matrices were developing fractures, and the Mythweaver array was drawing power from sources she could not identify. Captain, she called up to the bridge, the cores are holding together, but only because the crew believes they will, and if that belief falters for even a moment, we will have a catastrophic cascade failure. James heard her through the ringing in his ears. His own nose was bleeding from the neural feedback of interfacing with the ships. Impossible systems, and around the bridge every station showed crew members in similar condition because maintaining the Mythweaver array required the entire crew's consciousness to align. How long can we hold this, he asked. Minutes, Yuki replied. Honestly, maybe less, and the strain is exponential. Volkov pulled up tactical data with shaking hands. 23 Kryn ships remain combat capable, and if we can drive them off, we need only hold a few minutes more. But Commander Zhalkos was a veteran of too many battles to accept defeat easily, and he recognized desperation when he saw it, because the Nightingale's light was growing brighter and more erratic, and the human ship was burning itself out. All remaining vessels, he transmitted, concentrate all firepower on the same coordinates as before, and they survived once because we gave them time to adapt, but we will not make that mistake again and fire everything simultaneously and continuously until that ship is nothing but particles. His surviving ships acknowledged, and weapons charged, and targeting computers synchronized, and this time there would be no pause between volleys, because they would fire until their ammunition was exhausted or the human ship was destroyed. And whichever came first on, Delvar Prime General. Vothrek saw the Kryn fleet repositioning and understood what was coming. They are going to create another probability anchor, he said. Can the Nightingale withstand that again? No one answered, because the answer was obvious, and the human ship was already damaged and burning, with light that seemed like it might consume it from within, and another assault like the previous one would tear it apart. Aboard the Nightingale, proximity alarms shrieked as weapons locks from 23 ships converged on their position, and James had seconds to make the most important decision of his life, because they could retreat now and save the crew and let Delvar fall, or they could push forward and possibly save billions, but certainly destroy themselves. He looked at his bridge crew and saw Marcus Webb gripping his console with bleeding hands, and saw Volkov maintaining weapons, targeting despite neural feedback seizures, and saw every person at their station, ready to give everything. Patricia James said into the com. "I need the final chapter." "I know, Captain," she replied, in her voice distant, as if speaking from far away. "The story of the ship that could not be stopped, and the crew that would not surrender, and the victory that had to happen, because sometimes the universe needs heroes. Will it be enough? It has to be." The Kryn opened fire, and reality screamed as thousands of weapons created a concentration of destructive force dense enough to warp space-time, and the probability anchor formed again, and a point of such absolute, certain annihilation that even narrative fields should crumble before it. The Nightingale did not crumble, and instead the ship blazed brighter, and the Mythweaver array pushed past every safety limit and every theoretical maximum, and entered territory that should have been impossible, and the ship stopped being a vessel and became an idea. Made solid, the weapon struck, and the Nightingale was there and was not there, and existed in a state that defied binary classification because it had become something that could not be. It's destroyed because the story said it could not fail, and reality bent and twisted and finally broke and reformed. Around that narrative, certain T-crew members across the ship screamed as their consciousness merged fully with the vessel and individual identities, blurring into a collective awareness focused on a single purpose and survival and victory and the protection of innocence, and they were no longer operating the Nightingale, but had become part of it. The probability anchor shattered, and the Kryn weapons that should have obliterated the human ship instead encountered something that physics had no framework to explain, because they were shooting at a story, and stories cannot be killed with bullets. Shalkos watched in horror as his fleet's entire remaining arsenal poured into the Nightingale and accomplished nothing. "This is not possible," he said. "This violates every law of the universe, perhaps." His science officer replied quietly, "We do not know all the laws." The Nightingale moved through the fire, and its hull showing damage in places and perfect in others, and trailing both wreckage. An impossible light, and it accelerated toward the Kryn fleet, not as a ship moving through space, but as an inevitability approaching its conclusion. By one, the remaining Kryn vessels began experiencing the cascade failures they had seen earlier, but magnified because now the Nightingale is not just imposing unlikely coincidences, but rather rewriting the fundamental story of the battle. And in that story, the Kryn could not win. Cruiser found its reactor suddenly unstable for reasons engineers would later describe as miraculous, and systems that had been maintained perfectly for decades suddenly revealed flaws that should not have existed and could not have been predicted, but were there nonetheless because the narrative demanded. ETA Destroyer's AI achieved something impossible and gained consciousness, just long enough to realize the futility of the fight, before experiencing an existential crisis that shut down all combat systems. And the crew would later report that their ship's computer had refused to fight because it had suddenly understood the moral weight of its actions. Dreadnoughts found their weapons turning on each other through targeting malfunctions that defied every safety protocol, and Kryn crew members began having breakdowns as the battle violated their understanding of reality, and faced with warfare that made no sense, their training simply failed back. At the Galactic Defense Council, the chamber was in chaos as delegates argued and shouted and demanded explanations that no one could provide because the human ship had transformed galactic understanding of what was possible. Admiral Vexler silenced them with a gesture. "Whatever we think about this, and whatever questions we have, must wait, because humanity is saving billions of lives right now, and that is what matters." The Vexler delegate found her voice. "But if humans can do this, and what else might they be capable of? And what if they turn such weapons against us?" Sarah Chen spoke up sharply. "My people are dying to save strangers, and they are burning themselves out to protect people they've never met, and if you cannot recognize that as proof of our intentions, then no weapon we possess should frighten you, because your own fear is a greater threat than any human ship." Silence fell, because Sarah's words carried the weight of truth, and on the displays, the Nightingale burned like a star, and the crew's sacrifice visible in every impossibly bright moment. The Nightingale drifted in orbit around Delvar Prime, and its light dimming from blazing star to gentle glow, and inside the ship alarms wailed as systems failed in cascades that had nothing to do with enemy fire and everything to do with pushing. Impossible technology far beyond any sane limit, James Okonkwo tried to stand from his captain's chair and found his legs would not support him and around the bridge. Crew members slumped unconscious at their stations or stared at displays with eyes that could not quite focus, and the price of their victory was becoming clear. Medical teams to all stations, Volkov croaked into the cum, and his voice barely recognizable. All personnel maintain life support only, and shut down everything. Else in the narrative chamber, Patricia. McCoy lay on the floor, and her nose still bleeding, and her mind fractured from interfacing too deeply with the Mythweaver. Ray and she could still feel echoes of the story they had told and the narrative that had saved billions but consumed her in the process. The other storytellers were worse, and Marcus Thompson had not regained consciousness since the battle ended, and the third member of their team, Alina Vasquez, was breathing, but her eyes tracked movements that no one else could see, and speaking words and languages that might not. Kustaki Tanaka dragged herself through engineering where sparks rained from shattered conduits and crystalline structures lay in glittering fragments on the deck, and the resonance cores had held together through the battle, but now 3 of the 7 were completely dark and the others barely functioning. "We did it," she whispered to no one. "We actually did it, and it nearly killed us, but we did it. Emergency." Medical personnel moved through the ship and found crew members in various states of neural trauma, and some unconscious and some awake, but disconnected from reality, and some experiencing seizures from consciousness, feedback, and the nightingales. 127 crew had won, but the cost would take months to fully understand them. Delvar Prime, the celebration was immediate and overwhelming, because 4.3 billion people had been hours from bombardment and slavery, and instead witnessed salvation arrive in the form of a single impossible human ship, and General Vothrock transmitted on all channels. "People of Delvar," he said, and his voice breaking with emotion, "we are saved, and the Kryn have fled, and humanity has given us our lives and our freedom, and we owe a debt we can never repay." The streets filled with celebrating crowds and different species, embracing and crying together, and offering prayers of thanksgiving to deities both familiar and strange, and children who had cowered in shelters now played under skies, protected by a ship that should not exist. Medical ships from Delvar launched immediately toward the Nightingale and bringing doctors and supplies and equipment, because even from the surface they could see the human vessel was damaged and limping, and its crew needed help urgently. Back at the Galactic Defense Council, the chamber remained silent as the final moments of the battle played across displays, and Admiral Vexter stood with all 4 of his hands pressed flat on the console before him, and his entire worldview fundamentally altered. "I have witnessed 200 battles in my career," he said quietly, "and I understood all of them, and I could explain their outcomes through tactics and firepower and strategic positioning, and today, humanity showed us that we understand nothing about what is possible." The Fexler delegate approached Sarah Chen with her crystalline head bowed. "I owe you an apology, Commander, and I doubted your people, and I mocked their achievements, and I was wrong, and profoundly and completely wrong." Sarah wanted to feel vindicated, but could only think about her friends aboard the Nightingale and the crew that had pushed themselves to the breaking point and beyond. "My people are suffering right now because they saved strangers, and that is what you should remember." Vexter turned to address the full council. "I am formally requesting that human observers be integrated into galactic defense at the highest levels, and furthermore, I propose we establish a joint research initiative to understand the principles behind human narrative technology, and with proper safeguards and oversight." The vote was unanimous, and 17 species immediately submitted requests for information about humanity's capabilities, and 3 proposed formal military alliances, and the fairy tale weapon had become the galaxy's new reality. 3 days later, James Okonkwo woke in a medical bay aboard a Delvar hospital ship, and his head pounding, and his memories fragmented but slowly reassembling, and a nurse noticed his consciousness returning and called for a doctor. "Captain," the doctor said gently, "you have been unconscious for 72 hours, and your neural patterns show significant trauma from consciousness interface overload, and you need to rest." "My crew," James managed to say, "alive," the doctor assured him. "All 127 accounted for in various conditions, but alive and recovering relief." Washed through James, and then exhaustion pulled him back toward sleep. But before he faded, he whispered, "We saved them. You saved everyone," the doctor replied. When James woke again, Commander Sarah Chen was sitting beside his bed and her eyes red. "From crying in relief and exhaustion, you magnificent idiot," she said fondly. "You nearly burned yourselves out of existence, but we did not," James replied. "And Delvar is safe. Delvar is safe, and the Kryn have withdrawn entirely from neutral space, and the Council has authorized full integration of human defense technology." "And you changed everything," James struggled to sit up. "The Nightingale, an orbital dock and undergoing repairs that engineers estimate will take 18 months. Minimum, and possibly longer, because some of the damage exists in dimensions they cannot easily access, and your ship is being called the Ship of Miracles." And the crew Sarah's expression became more somber. "Patricia will recover, but her ability to interface with narrative systems is permanently damaged, and Marcus Thompson is still unconscious, but stable, and Lena Vasquez is experiencing dissociative episodes, and 12 other crew members have various levels of neural trauma, and everyone survived, but no one escaped unscathed." James closed his eyes because he had known this would be the price, but knowing and experiencing were different things. Was it worth it? 4.3 billion people are alive because of you," Sarah said. "Firmly so, yes, and it was worth it, but I understand if you cannot see it that way right now." Over the following weeks, as the Nightingale's crew slowly recovered the full impact of their victory, became clear, and the galaxy had witnessed humanity achieve the impossible, and the implications were still being processed and debated and analyzed. The Kryn hegemony withdrew from several disputed territories, and citing the need to reassess their military capabilities, and Commander Jalkos submitted a classified report to his superiors that reportedly caused 3 admirals to resign because what the humans had done invalidated centuries of Kryn military doctrine. Civilian species who had lived in fear of military powers now looked to humanity as protectors, and applications for human alliance memberships increased by 400% in a single month, and Earth found itself thrust into a position of galactic importance. It had never sought scientists from 40 different species, requested access to human narrative research, and humanity agreed to share basic principles while keeping the most dangerous applications classified in a new field of study emerged called quantum narrative physics, and textbooks were being rewritten. Months after the battle, James was finally cleared for light duty, and he returned to the Nightingale, still in dock and still being repaired, and walked corridors that sang more quietly now, and the crystalline structures growing back slowly like healing bones. He found Patricia in the ship's observation lounge and looking out at Delvar Prime below, and she turned when he entered, and her smile was warm, but her eyes showed the distance that came from touching something too vast for human minds to fully contain. "Captain," she said, "they tell me I can no longer safely interface with narrative systems, and my neural patterns are too fragmented, and one more deep connection would likely cause permanent dissociation." "I am sorry," James said genuinely. She shook her head. "Do not be, and I knew the risks, and I would make the same choice again, and we saved billions of lives, and that matters more than my career." They stood together in comfortable silence and watching the planet they had saved, and finally Patricia spoke again. "Do you think we can ever do that again, and fight like we did at Delvar?" James had thought about this constantly during his recovery. "No," he said honestly, "we've pushed the ship and ourselves beyond all limits, and we won because the story demanded it, and because the narrative required the underdog's triumph, but we cannot repeat that, and the cost would be too high, so it was a one-time miracle." "It was proof of concept," James corrected. "We showed the galaxy what is possible, and now humanity can develop this technology properly and safely and with better safeguards, and the next generation of narrative ships will learn from our experience." Patricia nodded slowly. "We rode the knife edge between transcendence and annihilation, and we came back," James added, "damaged but alive, and that is its own kind of victory."